Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Knowledge Miles lecture. This is part of the Lord Mayor's lecture series brought to you by Zien Group and the Gresham Society. And today's lecture is entitled What's Happening to Religion in England? And we're delighted to welcome the very Reverend Andrew Tremlett, the Dean of St Paul's Cathedral. Next slide, please. My name is Ian Harris. I'm actually here in sort of two capacities. I am a director of Zien Group. It's a little unusual for the Knowledge Mile series to have a Zien person chairing the morning. I'm also a Gresham Society person, so I wear more than one hat, and I'm sort of here in my Gresham Society capacity, I suppose. Those of you who attend Zien events know that I have some experience of chairing this sort of thing, and chairing basically means saying a few words and then getting out of the way and letting the speaker say what they're going to say. Next slide, please. So this is the agenda. It's very straightforward. At the very most 5 minutes of my introduction, I know my place. And then we should have about 20 to 25 minutes for Andrew Tremlett to talk to us on today's topic. And we're hoping to therefore hold back about 20 minutes, 20 minutes for questions and answers. So before I hand over to Andrew, I just want to say a few words about how questions and answers work. Many of you will have been here before, but some of you won't have been. So Andrew and I are sort of locked into what you might call a virtual crypt within GoToWebinar this morning. So if you are here watching the live show and want to ask questions, please do so using the GoToWebinar tools. That's all we're going to be able to see between now and 11:45. So please use those tools. We won't see anything if you try to phone us, if you try to text us, if you try to send us emails. We'll get them after. Now, we hope to be able to tackle all of the questions that come in today. Andrew has very kindly said that if there are lots of questions and we don't get through all of them, he will endeavour to answer your questions outside today's talk, if or when they come in, or if we're not able to handle them during the 45 minutes. I would also like, just before I hand over, to welcome everybody, not just those of you who are joining us in person today, but also those of you who will be joining on the catch-up service after today's show. I know from looking at the stats, there are probably more of you joining on catch-up than are actually able to attend in person. You two are very welcome, and I hope you enjoy everything that we hear from Andrew and that we discuss afterwards. So without further ado, I will disappear and leave the floor to today's speaker, the very Reverend Andrew Tremlett.
Ian, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you so much for your very warm welcome. I hope by now that we're sharing a screen and you're able to see a slide there for the start of this. So thank you very much for your introduction. Maybe just a few words about myself. This is my hometown, Plymouth, in the south of Devon. If you have a surname like Tremlett, you're probably going to come from the southwest, probably from Devon. If you have a mother whose name is Lapthorne, then the intersection of those two surnames put you absolutely in the southwest of Devon. Just a little bit of background for me. My mum and dad, neither of them went to university. Dad left school at 15, worked on the railways and then in road haulage. So education was something that they really, really valued. And I think I have to say, I didn't really have any choice over education, if I can put it that way. It was a real expectation. And also maybe to say religiously, I came from quite a conservative Christian background. Faith was very much part of the context as I was growing up. And then, like many others, got to be able to travel, spent some time in India. I worked for the Missions to Seafarers in Rotterdam, have had the chance to travel reasonably widely, and that's also shaped me. And I suppose the third thing to say is that I'm married to an academic, Professor Maggie Dawn, whose first career was as a pop singer, now an academic. And so I'm quite mindful that I'm doing this as a kind of reflective practitioner rather than as a thoroughgoing academic. And maybe that's a caveat as I start. So I'm going to start with a bit of a story. Before I trained for ordination, I went to university, and in the holidays, I used to work in NatWest Bank in Plymouth. And down on the Barbican, which is the waterfront area in Plymouth, there was a great mural on the wall, and I've got a picture up. And this mural was painted by a man called Robert Lenkovich, who was an astonishing artist. This is a self-portrait, and this really does capture Robert. This is really, really what he was like. Anyway, Robert had a studio down on the Barbican with a little a window, shopfront window, and at lunchtime, when I was about 21, 22, I was walking around the Barbican at lunch, and I saw a little note in the corner that said, education project, sitters wanted. And it rather intrigued me, the idea of having my portrait painted. So I knocked on the door, and it was a portrait in a huge mural, so it wasn't just sort of me individually. But in the course of conversation, Robert said, "So what are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I've just done a degree. I'm just going off to train to be for the Church of England." And he said, I won't repeat the exact words he said, but it was basically, what on earth are you doing wasting your life? Nobody's going to believe in all this nonsense by the time we get to the millennium. So this was in 1986, August 1986. And it's quite difficult, really, to sort of think back into the culture then. But certainly the sense was a rising tide of secularism and the kind of assumption that the place of faith would largely disappear. And it got me thinking, and it's something that stayed with me for these past 30, 40 years, is what faith is looking like in a changing culture. So that's really the basis of the question. What's happening to religion in England? And I want to start by talking about a wonderful academic, Grace Davey, who was a professor of sociology of religion in Exeter. And Grace wrote significantly about religion in Britain. Wonderful, really, really stimulating stuff. And part of it was observational. Observational that statistically, since the 1851 census, people's identification as attending a religious setup, organization, service has been in pretty continuous decline over that period at a very steady rate, a rate of a loss of about 1% of the adult population per decade. But at the same time, she recognized that there was persistence in religious phenomenon. And one of the examples she used, and you can tell this is the era when she was particularly writing and reflective, was around the funeral of Princess Diana. And you remember that incredible outpouring of emotion and observance, very much actually like we saw at the funeral of Her Late Majesty the Queen 18 months ago. And she coined the phrase, Grace coined the phrase, believing without belonging, believing without belonging, and focused on a thing called vicarious religion. The idea, the word vicar means the substitute, the idea that people want religion to happen, they just don't want to do it themselves. They want somebody else to do it for them, and they want it to be there and to be accessible, even if they don't want to turn up on a wet Tuesday morning or regularly in church on a Sunday or mosque or synagogue. I became very interested in this as I worked in ministry, that very often in parish life, you find people really want the church to be there, but they wouldn't dream of turning up regularly. I then started to think about how this compares with other forms of what you might call social engagement. And the little graph I've got is from the latest House of Commons Library report on uh, reported membership of political parties. And you can see towards the left hand of the graph, in the 1950s, for example, Conservative Party membership was around 3 million people. Today, in the right-hand side of the graph, you can see it's running at around 200, 250. Similarly, for the Labour Party, around 1 million in the 1950s, gentle decline. The bump at the end is to do with the £10 party members. And we've now got an extraordinary situation where actually the total number of members of political parties is remarkably small for our general population. And it prompted the thought in me that maybe what's happening is that people are starting to not want to sign up to institutional belonging. Another way to look at this is in terms of trades union membership. You can see there moving from the left-hand side of the graph at the end of the 19th century, at the start of the trades union movement, moving through into the 1970s, 80s, a peak of around 12, 13 million, and now around 6 or 7 million. So something's clearly happening around people's institutional belonging and identification. And whereas in church we tend to focus on, do people attend church? Do they want to be there? Are they part of this community? What's their belief? Um, this gave me the sense that we might need to sort of step back slightly and say, what's happening to belonging slightly more widely? In the church, we call it the McDonaldization of the church. The idea that you go into McDonald's, you have a screen, you choose your burger, your fries, your drink, you press a button, you pay, and then you go up to the counter, and then you have your product and you walk out again. And so much of people's lives are dominated by those transactional kind of relationships. Whereas, of course, being part of a religious community or indeed a political party is much more relational, and it puts you in the room with people who you may be uncomfortable with. You have to turn up on the proverbial wet Tuesday in February to hand out leaflets or serve on committee, to do stuff, and it requires a different nature of engagement. This is a lovely quote from Grace. The churches in Europe are still considered a public utility, but they come to attention only if they're taken away. So if you try to close a church in a rural area, well, good luck with that. Religion in Europe is like an iceberg. Most of what is interesting is under the water and out of view. And I think that's absolutely right. We focus on the number of people in church or at mosque or in synagogue on a particular day as a member, as a record of membership. In fact, quite a lot of what's going on is happening elsewhere. Linda Woodhead, working at King's, fantastic scholar, really interesting work, curated a massive global project on looking at this. Linda took a slightly broader view and, along with Grace, coined a term which you might say European exceptionalism. The idea that in Europe we've often, probably rather arrogantly, thought of ourselves as being at the vanguard of kind of thought development, and particularly around religion, that the world was kind of increasingly secular, and in Western Europe we were marching on to a bright future, a bit like my painter Robert Lenkiewicz was saying. The problem is that anybody who's travelled widely realizes that the rest of the world didn't get the memo, that actually the vast majority of people globally self-identify with a particular religion and indeed practice it. So rather than Western Europe being kind of at the vanguard, it could be that Europe is increasingly becoming the odd one out. And that's an interesting perspective. Of course, recent census just show the current trends are continuing. Christians are now a minority in England and Wales. If you look at this graph of those who identify as Christians. So on the left-hand side, in 2001, 71.7% of people identified as Christian. At the most recent census, that's 46.2. And similarly, those who said they had no religion, 2001 was about 14%, now 37%, and a significant increase in the Muslim population from 3 to 6.5%. Of course, it's worth saying that when I was a child growing up, if you went into hospital and you were asked your religion, of course, you were put down, if you said that you didn't have a religion, you would be put down as Church of England. It was kind of default position. And now, 50, 60 years later, we're more honest. We're more real about these things. We say we have no religion and it's recorded as such. So some of this may also be simply about people being more accurately recorded and having greater confidence in their position. There's certainly a significant geographical disparity in England and Wales. I was until recently Dean of Durham, until 18 months ago. In that part of the world, far more people identify it with a particular, with the Christian faith, and that's different around the country. You'll see the maps, and increasingly in the metropolitan areas, increasingly less so. This is an interesting set of slides, which is really looking at this over age. So if you were to talk to somebody who's a decade older than me, around 70, quite likely that around 4 in 10 would say that they were Church of England. About 10% would say they're Roman Catholic, about 30% would say they were other, and about 20% would say they don't have any religious affiliation. If you ask the same question of somebody who's under 20, you get a very different picture. A similar number of people who are Roman Catholic. It may be actually that they're a different kind of Roman Catholic coming from different parts of the world. And similarly, those who are other may be a different other. The older age group might include other Christian denominations, Baptist, Methodist. In the younger generation, it's more likely to include people from other faith communities, non-Christian faith communities. But the huge decline has been in those who affiliate as the Church of England, so now down to around 10%, and the increase of those who don't define as any particular religion. They have what's called nuns. So in one way, my portrait painter, Robert Lenkovich, was absolutely right. People's the place of religion has changed, and not quite as catastrophically as he thought, and nor globally as he thought, but definitely there's been a change. But of course, as a clergyman in the Church of England, I observe a lot of other things. For example, as Dean of St. Paul's, it's very difficult to think that faith has a very significant part in the City of London. It's a very benign environment for people of faith. Just last night, the Lord Mayor and the Lady Mayoress, Michael and Elizabeth, hosted a wonderful, wonderful occasion for leaders of faith communities based in the city and on the edges of the city. So the city Hindus, city Sikhs, Catholics, Church of England, Wesleyan Methodists, a very great variety, Jews and Muslims were there. And it gave really good expression to the way the city encourages and fosters faith. We think about some of our big civic occasions in the city. This is the United Guild service, which will be coming around in March. A huge ceremonial occasion, but it happens in St. Paul's Cathedral. We think about the way that we mark remembrance is very often in a religious context. So the cenotaph becomes absolutely the center for a religious observance. You think about the funeral of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth, what an extraordinary outpouring was of a religious sensibility. And that's a very persistent and pervasive thing about British and particularly English culture, or indeed the coronation last year taking place within the context of an explicitly religious occasion. And it's extraordinary to think that in the 21st century that was repeated after some thought that there would be a change of direction. It was notable the level of continuity. So just if I can return to my earlier slide, which was about the change in religious affiliation and the growth there of people who don't identify with a particular religion. That's a very interesting and notable change that's happened over the years. I gave some indication earlier that some of that may well be around a greater level of honesty, a greater level of public acceptance, there no longer being a public perception that you really ought to be, that it was kind of socially correct to identify with a religion. Decades and decades ago, the Church of England used to be called, the Conservative Party at prayer. It no longer is. It doesn't operate in that way. And part of that change, I think, is a greater sense of people's autonomy and wishing to set their own stall out. So, in fact, that runs in parallel to the loss of political affiliation as well. So at the same time as religious belonging to particular institutional forms of religion has declined, you can see a correlation with the same process happening in terms of political party membership and trades union. And interestingly, the same thing applies in terms of what Grace Davey was talking about in terms of vicarious religion. All of us, or many of us, still think that politics is important. We just don't want to do it ourselves. A lot of us think that trades unionism is really important. Fewer of us want to do it ourselves. We're much more happy for somebody to do it for us. And that pool of people doing it for us is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And that's running alongside this transactional relationship that we have in other bits of our life. But here's a different way of looking at it. If you go back to your group of people that I was talking about earlier, your over 70s down through to your under 20s, and you ask a different question, not do you belong to a religious group, do you sign up to it, but do you have a belief in God or a higher power? Do you have a sense of the divine, a sense of greater purpose, something like that? And what's interesting here is that with the over 70s, you end up with, which is the top line here, you end up with essentially 5 groups across the spectrum, ranging from definitely through to probably, through to don't know, through to probably not, through to definitely not. So that's an interesting thing. That within all age groups, there's a clear spread of people. The interesting thing, of course, is if you look down to the bottom line, to the under 20s, actually the bars are pretty much, not exactly the same, but pretty much in the same sort of ballpark. There's difference, less being definite about belief in God, but not an extraordinary change, and certainly nothing like the sort of change you saw in the graph above. So here's two observations on that. First of all, is that in that group who are over 70, roughly 45% said that they either don't know, probably not, or definitely not. So 45% said don't know, probably not, definitely not. But if you compare that with the number who belong to a religious group, of course, the group who said none was only 20%. And this chimes in with something that you find if you're working in churches or synagogue or mosque. Actually, there are a lot of people involved in those whose faith content is relatively small, who either are really not sure or are definitely sure that it's not true. So the correlation between belonging to religion and believing is not necessarily as strong as you think, which is a really interesting observation. So in that older age group, there are plenty of people who don't believe or really aren't sure or just don't know, but still lots of them are part of churches, so or synagogues or mosques. So there isn't necessarily a correlation between the two things. And the second really interesting thing is that if you ask this question, a belief in God or a higher power, and you ask it of the people who say they have no religious affiliation, you get a really interesting set of answers. And this is my final slide, because I'm going to come to an end in a moment. If you ask the group who say no religion, actually, and then you say to them, so do you have a belief in God? About a quarter of them will say they definitely believe in God. 20% will say that they probably do. 18% will say they don't know. 16% probably not. 20% definitely not. In other words, their level of belief is almost identical to what you would generally find for religious or non-religious people. It's not significantly different. So again, the people who say they have no religious affiliation is not the same as saying people have no belief. So we just need to take a little step back, I suppose, is what I'm saying, in terms of the census data, and then getting under the skin of this to say, well, what does it mean when people say they have no religion? Clearly, it marks a change in behavior. The question is, to what extent is that matched by a change in belief? And one of the extraordinary things about working in a cathedral space where you don't ask people to belong in, sign up to things, you don't ask them to go on a rota, you don't ask them to read the lesson, you don't ask them to, go on the regular giving or whatever, is how by being very open and accessible in that way, uh, people respond to that in a different way. So I'm going to wrap up there because I'm just over the 20 minutes and say thank you very much for listening. I hope that's been of interest and given one or two insights into what's happening to religion in England. And Ian, I'm very happy to take any questions.
Andrew, thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. Maybe I made a mistake by nagging the audience to send in their questions a couple of times, because in the last 10 minutes we've had a flood of questions coming in, and some of them are absolutely terrific questions. In fact, they're all good questions. I'm going to need to group some of these, I think, and we might not get through. We might not get through all of them. The first one I'm going to take is actually from Maris. I thought this was a fascinating question. Famous Christian debater William Lane Craig once said that people are becoming more and less religious at the same time. There is no longer peer pressure to go to church over the weekend. So numbers of people who affiliate with Christianity who no longer affiliate with Christianity is increasing, but people who are going to church are more religious and zealous because they've made a deliberate choice to be there. It's a slightly different angle on the points you were making towards the end of your talk. I'd be interested to hear your reflections on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it, becoming more and less religious. Um, so it seems to me that the religious institutions that are thriving at the moment seem to be at two ends of the spectrum. One is either the kind of big scale stuff where you turn up either in a kind of cathedrals type setting or a large mosque or a big synagogue community where actually you're able to be part of something bigger, if I can put it that way. So, for example, in St. Paul's, between the afternoon of Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, we had 15,000 people worship with us. It was an extraordinary thing. 400,000 people came to worship during the course of the year last year. So at one, that kind of big scale stuff, that seems fairly robust. My impression is that at the smaller scale, where you have very high level of commitment to um, uh, uh, groups that have very clear and defined boundaries, where you're very clearly in or you're very clearly out, those are also similarly robust and surviving. The bit in the middle, which requires uh, the more routine, if I can put it, um, uh, support seems to be much more difficult to maintain these days. So I think there's a parallel, for example, with getting people to be school governors or to run brownies or scouts or things like that, that actually to get involved in these organizations now requires a level of kind of taking on of responsibility that people are less willing to do. Um, so sometimes having those very, very clear boundaries helps people because then once they're inside, they're absolutely committed. And you can see that across religious spectrum. Um, on the other hand, those groups which are very porous, where there are really no boundaries to come in, it's very easy. Those are also seeming to thrive. But I think it's the group in the middle that are not. But if I can just make one addition, Ian, there was a brilliant report written about 10 years ago looking at the place of mission within cathedrals. And it gave a lot of sort of encouragement that these could be places of great creativity and music and art and all the rest of it. Um, but it then said at the end, in a time of drought, the fish swim to the deepest part of the pond. And there is, of course, the risk that these places that are open and have porous boundaries simply suck people in because they're easier. It's what Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian, used to call cheap grace.
Thank you. That's a really interesting answer to a very interesting question. Another very interesting question, which is actually quite closely aligned to the question I had up my sleeve, just in case we
Mm.
didn't get this type of question, comes from Andrew Pullman, who asks, do you think that the growth in social media has had an influence on people not wanting or needing religion as much? And actually, it's slightly to the side of the question that I was going to ask about, which was the use of social media or webinar technology, like the technology we're using now,
Yeah.
as the way of getting people actually to join in with religion.
Mm.
I certainly noticed
Mm.
that a lot during the pandemic when I was
Yeah.
doing my food charity work. We were delivering to a lot of people who were engaging with their
Yeah.
religion, whichever religion it was,
Yes.
through electronic means. And I think a lot of people have continued to do that
Yes.
post-pandemic.
Yeah, Ian, and thank you, Andrew. That's a fantastic question. If I can take it in two parts and take Ian's part first, um, certainly during the pandemic, I think it had an incredibly positive impact. At the time, I was Dean of Durham, and literally on day one of lockdown, we went, full live streaming twice a day. Um, and it was an incredible period of growth, actually, because we would be joined by people from around the world. And the thing that I really noticed at that time was, because people's other routines had been severely disrupted, they weren't able to go, out on the school run, they weren't able to go shopping, they weren't all the things you weren't allowed to do. That having regular live streaming provided a kind of almost monastic rhythm to the day. And so we would live stream several times a day, and people would have it there. And a lot of people would say, for example, over morning prayer, they'd be having their breakfast with morning prayer on in the background as a kind of, almost a radio kind of thing. And it helped them to mark the days. So I think that was incredibly positive, and I know in Durham colleagues there have continued that great work. I think the question on social media and its impact more broadly is a slightly different one. I think um, the obvious thing is that because social media uses algorithms related to the content that you particularly like, it clearly acts as an echo chamber. What it does is it exacerbates what you like to hear. So if I can give an example, I'm not great on social media, and I've practically stopped now. But back in the day on Facebook, a lot of my Facebook friends were clergy from around the Church of England, and I can remember in the Brexit debate that when that came voted for Brexit, the response from fellow clergy was quite extreme, quite extreme. They could not believe that this had happened, and it was a really interesting example of the echo chamber, because their own social media had been fed by other like-minded people, and they couldn't believe that this was going to happen. So, that's what they read. They read similar posts. Whereas I think if you lived outside of London, that came as less a surprise. So I think the short answer is yes, I think that is having a very significant effect. I'm not sure that it's having a particular effect in stopping people going to church or synagogue, though.
Thank you for that. I'm going to need to group some of these questions to try to get through enough of them, and we still might not get through all of them. There are a few that are focusing on the question of loss of faith or reduction of faith. There's one here from Christian de Vartavan, who also comments that his family also come from Devon and Plymouth and the like. But asks, has the loss of faith to do with the loss of religious education in a broad sense, and the way that education is made by schools and churches across the population? There are one or two other questions along those lines. Neville McNully says, thank you for the presentation, and asks, in view of the small proportion of under 20s belonging to religious denominations and a larger proportion believing in God, to what extent is this a result of disdain for church practice? Or is it embracing a shift in secular values? There's another somewhat related question. They're all different questions and yet related. Max Weaver asks, is it right to link the analysis so strongly to belief in a divine being rather than a belief in gospel that helps us to see what is right and good and answers the Socratic type question, how should we live our lives?
Yes.
So three different questions, but coming at this really difficult subject about what do we actually mean when we're saying religion or faith or all of these things. So good luck with those.
Wonderful. Ian, you always want to challenge me, and I send out greetings to a fellow Devonian. So loss of RE. Actually, I would take a rather different view. I think that one of the strongest, most robust, and from my perspective, encouraging thing is the strength of church school education. it's something like 1 in 5 children across the country attend a church school. And of course, it's worth remembering that particularly primary education was mainly delivered by churches through the 19th century, particularly in the middle of the 19th century, and the state stepped in when churches weren't able to provide that to a sufficient quality and quantity. And it is an extraordinary comparison when you look at the UK compared to other European countries, the extent to which the state actually supports different churches and different faiths involvement in education. And quite often people within my own church say, well, if only we had a tax system like you have in other countries. And I often say, well, actually, we do have a tax system. It pays for our church school education. So I think particularly church schools have become much more confident in their role. I think the difference, though, is that within schools that don't identify with a religious heritage, then that then can become a more contested thing. So I think it's a fair question to ask as to whether actually we're ending up with a greater disparity, if you like, between those schools where this is absolutely part of their warp and weft, and it's very naturally woven into the curriculum, and those where it's such a minority sport that's having an impact. The second one was around the decline in church practice, and a sense of, is this really for us kind of stuff.
Yep.
So I do think that's right, but I'm skeptical, if I can put it this way, that packaging things is necessarily the way ahead. If I give you a little anecdote from my time at Westminster Abbey, I had the privilege of being there when Prince William and Catherine Middleton were married, and it was just an amazing occasion. But a few weeks later, a group of clergy from the West Country came up to London, and I did a day with them. And during that day, a group of them really had a go at me about that being a lost opportunity to showcase modern contemporary worship, and using a worship band and worship songs and that kind of style. And I listened very carefully, and then I said to them, just tell me what your hairdresser thought of the service. And without thinking, they said, oh, they loved it. And I sort of said, yeah, isn't that the point? That within a religious community, you can sort of think you know what people want without necessarily asking them. And maybe we need to not make presuppositions about what people want, because sometimes a very traditional form of worship can be very secure and safe for people. It's a known quantity. I think the last point that Max made was really good. The difference between God, sense of divine, and whether this is about gospel and belief. And of course, I think usually you would say that religious identification comes in 3 forms. One is about belief, one is about practice, and one is about cultural identification. And if somebody, as it were, is from the Jewish faith, and they hold religious views in that way, and they practice their faith, and they identify in that faith, then it's very clear that they are Jewish. If on the other hand, a person were to identify culturally as a Christian, for example, but neither believed nor practiced, then how would you actually measure that as being different to somebody who did all 3? And I think that's the conundrum around this, that religion isn't a single identifying factor is made up of certainly those three elements, and I'm sure more. So I think part of the difficulty of the analysis is that somebody might be saying, yes, they belong, but that may not mean that they believe. They may sit in different categories.
We're out of time, which is a shame, because there are some excellent questions, and you've touched on some of them. A few people have been asking about unity of faiths. So Nikki Holtzhausen asked about the idea of unity of faiths in tackling big global problems like climate change. Bob Harris sent in a few very interesting questions, including a question about, wars tend to have religious differences at heart. This is the time for us to try to find convergence and try to find common threads in faith, and so on. We've got quite a lot of questions about comparison between England and other countries. One Hugh person was wondering about America. There's a question about from Bernard Hormung about the growth of Roman Catholicism in Africa and so on. We need more than one webinar on this type of topic. It is such a huge topic. So all I can really do is to say thank you to everyone who chimed in with those questions. It was a terrific audience today. We had just under 100 people. And most of you asked questions. No, an awful lot of you asked questions, which was wonderful, and we're very, very attentive, which is wonderful. Just before we sign off, just to bring your attention to some forthcoming lectures. The slide tells the story on Monday next week. A world in debt. Is this global monster sustainable? On Thursday next week, how pollinator friendly is the City of London? And on Wednesday, the following week, how air pollution causes lung cancer in never smokers, and to just help you through your gloom via a therapeutically targetable inflammatory mechanism, which I think means that there is some hope for doing that. I would like to actually mention a couple more. We haven't yet publicised these, but they are on the way, and they're upbeat ones. On the 27th of February, Science City, 1550 to 1800. With Dr. Alexandra Rose from the Science Museum. That should be absolutely fascinating. I'm really looking forward to that one. And the 29th of February, also want to look forward to Gavin Starks, who's going to talk about a 1,000-year-long piece of music called Long Player, which is something that has fascinated me for years and years and years. And believe it or not, my wife and I quite often listen to chunks of it. He's going to be explaining what all of that means in terms of us taking a longer view on things, and should again be fascinating. And the other wonderful thing about all of that is that I won't be chairing these. I will be attending them and enjoying them as a member of the audience, which is good news for you as the audience and good news for me. All that remains is for me to give a huge thank you to you, the audience, to my colleagues at Zian and Gresham Society for organising all of this, but in particular to the very Reverend Andrew Tremlett. This has been a hugely enjoyable and fascinating morning. Andrew, thank you very much indeed to you, and to everyone who's attending or watching this on catch up. Thank you for coming along, and goodbye.
Bye. Thank you very much, Ian, and audience.